To seriously think about anything, we need to first be able to imagine that what we already believe might be wrong. This is much more difficult than it seems like, because to imagine that what you believe is already wrong, you need to know what it is you already believe. And then you need to be able to engage in the process of testing those beliefs. Now, this is incredibly important when it comes to violence, perhaps more important than other subjects, because we already have understandings of violence. Because it's such a significant topic, because it's a topic we have feelings about, because the threat of violence, the threat of victimization makes us feel vulnerability, fear, anger. Because it's a threat that exists in the social world, we already have ideas about it. We already have the emotions, we already have the thoughts, but also because society gives us a whole lot of ways of thinking. The problem is that those ways of thinking and understanding things, of interpreting an incident or thinking about what the motivations for a particular person in a situation might be, or what the best thing to do might be to reduce violence, all of those thoughts that we already have, which we don't make up ourselves, we kind of acquire them from the world we live in, from the society around us, the culture, various other elements. But those might actually be false. We might have incorrect interpretations based on incorrect frameworks and incorrect information. There's an even bigger risk underneath that, is that these understandings might be being deliberately manipulated, because the understandings of violence, as we'll see more and more, are linked to other aspects of society. So let's start with the idea. We need to work out what we already believe about violence, and we need to work out how we can check whether what we already believe is true or not. To do that, let's first ask the question, where do our understandings of violence come from? And there's a kind of assumption, if we get past the fact that we don't even have any kind of understandings and recognize that in fact we do, we have these implicit common sense beliefs about violence. We assume that they come from our direct experience of the world, and that's generally wrong. Rather than looking at it in that way, we can look at the ways in which the forces around us, the kind of the world around us, the culture, the religion, education, politics, and media, shape understandings of violent situations, violent incidents, violent motivations. And we can think about how these exist everywhere. They exist in social media, news media, entertainment, in schools, in faith-based organizations, in faith trainings, and religious frameworks of understanding. We can see them all there. And we can also see them in the way in which people just talk in everyday life, the way in which kind of ordinary conversations happen, the way in which parents tell their children things. They say, "Oh, don't take candy from strangers. Don't go to that area. Don't hang around with those people." These little bits of common sense are actually the things that shape our understanding of violence. And so this common sense that is pervasive around us and exists below the level of conscious awareness. The whole issue with common sense is that we're not consciously aware of it. It's not like, oh, I know this scientific fact. It's just like, oh, that's just obviously true. And everyone's always known that that's obviously true. And this kind of background of common sense shapes the way we experience the world. It shapes our understanding of the world. It specifically shapes our understanding of people. Why do people behave in certain ways? What ways do certain groups of people behave as opposed to other groups of people? How should we interpret certain situations? And so this background common sense understanding of violence shapes what we worry about, and it shapes what we don't worry about. This might be even more important, the shaping of what we don't worry about, the things that don't really come to our attention, but also the way in which it shapes what we worry about, and the way in which it gives us these kind of implied understandings of why things are happening, is something really worth looking into. So why do we even have understandings of violence? I mean, culturally, we need to think about violence, not necessarily in a formal academic way, but in this kind of common sense way, simply because of safety. That having a way of understanding threats of violence, having a way of understanding risks of harm, helps us avoid them. It helps us protect ourselves. It helps us anticipate dangerous situations. So there's a kind of a deep function there. And it also does something else. It helps us think about, well, how could we do things other than just avoiding dangerous situations? Could we do things like create an environment that was safer? And that's actually what all this whole project is about. Is like, how could we end up making our world safer? How could we end up not only making our personal lives safer, but making the kind of society around us safer? Are there understandings, are there actions that we can end up committing to that remove these kinds of risk, or at least moderate them in certain ways? Okay, so this question of where understandings of violence come from. One of the places they come from, certainly not the only one, but one of the big ones, which we'll explore later, not today, is from the media. Okay, and this includes news media, social media, entertainment media. All of them have got stories about violence, whether it's accounts of a homicide or a war in the news, whether it's social media giving you information about something going on, or whether it's just entertainment, whether it's action movies, or whether it's these kind of quasi-documentary series like CSI or Criminal Minds that are trying to understand, why do people do terrible things? Why do they become serial killers or serial rapists? All of those are giving you a version of reality. All of those are producing a way of thinking about the world. But none of them have the primary goal of telling you the truth. And that's something we need to reflect on very deeply. They may tell you the truth by accident, or they may not. But all of those forms of media are businesses. They have economic goals, and what they say and how they say it is to a large extent dependent on what they're trying to do economically as businesses. Are they trying to sell something? Are they trying to sell products or subscriptions? Is their economic model dependent on engaging your attention and keeping you focused on something else? Is it a scaffolding to be able to sell you advertising? So all of these questions of these ideas that come through media need to be understood in terms of what media is it, and what are the actual goals of that media system, which may not be obvious from the particular thing that you're listening to or looking at a particular moment. But it's an important step back to take. As soon as we realize that, we see certain patterns across most different media forms. Firstly, they focus on extreme forms of violence, unusual violence rather than everyday violence. They'll focus on a murder rather than two teenagers having a fight. They'll focus on a death in a family where one of the family members kills another family member, not where one family member is constantly verbally abusive to another. So it foregrounds certain kinds of violence and makes them seem more common and more present and a bigger problem they are, and it conceals other kinds of violence. And this is happening all the time with every account of violence. It's focusing your attention on something and focusing your attention off something else. And what we want to do is see if we can try and balance that a little bit. The other thing media generally does is it follows trends. So if a particular story starts taking off, if a particular kind of films it suddenly does well at the box office or on streaming services, they will reproduce more of that. If a news broadcaster finds people are giving attention to a certain story, they will look for more stories like that. And this question of trends then also exaggerates certain things even more and hides other things even more. So we need to be aware of the way in which the trending nature of media tends to give us this distorted version of reality. The other thing is that they have built into them implied explanations. Now, usually they're not overt explanations. If you read academic texts, often there's an overt explanation. They'll say, well, this is known to cause that. These don't generally work like that. They will slip in an explanation that is hidden. So, for instance, if a story about a serial killer will give attention to like, something happened in their childhood, or the story about a terrorist will give information about a religious group or political group that they belong to. And simply by doing that, they are creating a sense of an explanation for you. And later on, we'll deal with some key concepts in the media. We'll look at things like newsworthiness, moral panics, ideal victims. But for today, just be thinking about the way that all the different kinds of media are not giving you an accurate picture of violence, and they're not giving you accurate explanations of violence. Taking that even further, the next step to think about is the way in which accounts of violence are political. Now, there's a narrow meaning of political. Okay, they're used by political parties to try and win support, and certainly that is true. That certain political parties or certain governments will say, "Oh, you should be worried about this. You should be worried about these immigrants. You should be worried about this country that has nuclear weapons," and they use stories about violence to make you anxious and make you believe that supporting them will solve the problem that you're anxious about. But there's a much broader and much more important sense of politics, which isn't about political parties and voting and which parties in government. It's about politics in the sense of power. Who has power in society? Who controls things? Which groups decide what happens? Which groups get left out? Which groups are protected and privileged? Which groups are left deprived and vulnerable? And this could be on all different kinds of kind of axes. It can be around wealth. It can be around religion. It can be around age. So there are many different ways in which power is organized, but generally power is organized around making some people safer and more able to exercise violence, and making other people less safe and more likely to be victims of violence. And so there's a real politics around violence in two ways. Firstly, whose harm gets recognized, who gets sympathy, who gets support when something bad happens to them, when they are a victim of any kind of violence. So there's that, but there's also of whose violence gets justified, whose violence gets either concealed or normalized or justified. And these different accounts of violence serve these political, in the broad sense, purposes also. They shape who people trust, what networks they feel allegiance to, what behaviors they engage in. And when we start noticing that, we start noticing a number of very, very problematic things happening as a result of accounts of violence. We start seeing that accounts of violence are often very damaging to society because they create polarization, they create antagonism, they create fear, they create anger. And often they do this by creating scapegoat groups. They identify a group of socially vulnerable people who aren't part of the group that has more power. and they blame those people for a lot of social problems, and they mobilize a lot of anger and resentment and often violence against those groups. And in different situations, it can be different groups. It can be foreigners, it can be teenagers, it can be particular ethnic group, a particular religious group, particular gender minority, it can be a particular nation. But there's an organized blaming, the transferring of blame for sort of everyday anxieties and risks onto certain people. And the great danger with that is the way in which it starts fragmenting society and creating conditions of violence by the more powerful group against the less powerful group. So we need to think about the function of accounts of violence in terms of whether they have a positive or negative impact on society. Now, I want to look at a chapter written by James Gilligan at the beginning of his book, Violence Reflections on a National Epidemic, and just talk about some of the issues he raises, because they're really some of the issues that are on my mind, which I want us to think about. So Gilligan is from the United States. He's a psychiatrist, but he's worked his life in the United States American prison system. Okay, so the people he's dealing with, they are very, very violent offenders. These aren't just people who've committed a minor act of aggression. These are people serving very long life sentences, people who continue being violent once they've been incarcerated, continue acts of violence against other incarcerated people, against the staff of the institutions. So he's dealing with people who are really kind of caught up in very, very deep cycles of repetitive violence. And he's dealing primarily with men. So on the one hand, it's a story about prisoners, of social outcasts, people who are caught up in repetitive violence. It's also a kind of about gender, but it's much more than that. It's about trying to get inside a kind of psychology of violence. But that's not the part I want to focus on at the moment. I want to focus on the way in which he frames the problem. And he said essentially what I've been saying is that we already have understandings of violence. He argues that we already have these common sense theories of violence that function sort of in the background of our thinking. And he gives a really important quote there. He says, "Our choice is not between having a theory of violence and not having one. It is between having a conscious theory, which we can examine, question, criticize, and improve, or of having an unconscious theory, which will forever remain untested, neither provable nor disprovable, and therefore unimprovable." So essentially what he's saying is we've got theories of violence, not formal academic theories, kind of common sense, implicit theories. They shape how we think. We don't recognize them, and because we don't recognize them, it's difficult to assess whether they're true. We kind of just believe them because they feel like they make sense and because it seems that other people around us accept them. And that's where most people's thinking about violence comes from. The sense of like, oh, it feels like it makes sense, and well, if everyone else seems to agree, so that just must be the case. That's exactly what I want to push back against and say we need to radically rethink that. We need a different starting point. We need a starting point that is not common sense. We need a starting point that is based in evidence, much more critical thinking, and we need a way of proceeding that allows us to test the claims we're making. The other thing Gilligan points to is the way in which our thinking about violence is linked to a kind of cultural morality, and particularly to kind of certain religious traditions. And there what he's talking about is the fact that we have this kind of good and evil notion of violence, that good people don't do violence, evil people do violence. And so it becomes a kind of a moral judgment that when someone harms a lot of people, we think of them as a bad person. We think of that in terms of like good versus bad, us versus them. And we also think of it in terms of, well, they need to be punished. That the Abrahamic religions are really often quite big on punishment as the thing to do about people harming each other, but specifically because it's structured in terms of a kind of a cosmology of good versus evil. This is hugely problematic for a number of reasons. The first reason that Gilligan identifies is that talking about violence in terms of good and evil just doesn't do anything useful. It might make us feel better. It might make us feel better to condemn someone and to be outraged and to punish them. But in fact, historically, it does not lead to violence being reduced in society. It does something else, which I'm going to talk about more and more as we get deeper and deeper into this thinking, which is it creates a kind of a binary between us good people who are not violent and those bad people who are violent. It creates a victim-perpetrator dichotomy, which in fact in most cases isn't nearly as simple as that polarized thinking sets it up as being. And we need to, if we're going to think about violence deeply, we need to move away from this victim-perpetrator dichotomy, and we need to move away from the good and evil dichotomy, because violence is actually very, very complex and has many, many different forms, and they don't fall into those two neat divisions. Okay, so Gilligan says that, in fact, linked to this kind of this sort of moral view of violence as good and evil, we also have another implied sort of a more modern kind of rationalist theory. And this he identifies as rational self-interest. Okay, and he says that this works on the assumption that people commit acts of violence because they benefit from it. Okay? So you go into a bank and you shoot people and you steal the money so that you've got a lot of money. You mug someone, steal their money and their phone, because you want that cash. Okay, that a wife kills her husband so that she can claim life insurance policy. All of these things. So we assume that there's a material gain from acts of violence. And when we assume that, it leads us to conclude that, well, what we need to do then is we need to make the punishment outweigh the gain. If people are working on a rational self-interest framework of motivation, we just need to say to them, if you do that thing, we will see that the outcome is negative rather than positive. So if you mug someone, we will put you in jail for a length of time. If you kill someone, we'll put you in jail for an even longer time, or in some places you'll get the death penalty. So there's this idea that, okay, the people are motivated by gain, and you need to demotivate them. You need to de-incentivize it by introducing a punishment, and the punishment must be worse than the gain. And that's pretty much what underpins, it's not the only thing it underpins, but it's pretty much what underpins the criminal justice system. The policing, courts, prisons is largely kind of built on this assumption that we must make things not worth it because they are motivated by particular interests. And what happens then is that countries spend massive amounts on their budget on this kind of criminal justice system, on a sort of punitive-based criminal justice system that is meant to de-incentivize violence. And Gilligan is severely critical of that. And he points out that, well, this has been tried and this has not worked. He said this is one of the oldest systems that societies have tried for managing violence, and it's been a historical failure. Now, it hasn't been a total historical failure, because we can argue that not having those systems might have made things even more crazy, and that de-incentivizing things really is important in certain situations. but it's not the whole story, and we can't stop there and say, oh well, we've got these sort of punishments which are de-incentivizing things, and oh, that's good. Make sure the police are doing their job, make sure the courts are doing their job, make sure the punishments are horrible, and we'll solve this problem. It's just not true, though. Doing those things does not make the problem of violence go away. It may manage it up to a point in certain contexts, but it definitely doesn't make it go away. What it does do is it has another negative effect, is it directs attention from one thing to another thing. So by directing attention to punishment, it directs attention away from prevention. And this is really the big criticism, and this is really the focus of what I want us to think about. By focusing always on good and bad, on punishing the bad, it stops us thinking about, yes, but why did that happen in the first place? What are the deeper underlying things? Not just that someone is bad, it's that there are complex social, psychological, cultural forces at work. And when we focus on retribution and punishment, we stop thinking about deep underlying causes. And that's what I want us to be doing. That's what I want to walk you through, is what are these deeper ways of thinking about things that might be more effective, more cost-effective, but also more socially effective in terms of addressing the problem of violence. There, Gilligan focuses on one particular thing that he noticed a lot, and it is only one. It's not the whole story, but I think it's an interesting part of the story. Is he noticed that with the incarcerated men that he was dealing with, there was a particular thing that would seem to trigger the acts of violence. That the acts of violence were not primarily about, gaining material assets. They were a kind of reaction to a kind of situation, and particularly the really serious self-destructive violence that he would see was when people felt like their dignity, their humanity was being threatened. And so he says, people feel incomparably more alarmed by a threat to the self than by a threat to the body. By self, he means their kind of psychological, emotional self, rather than their physical body. The death of the self is a far greater concern than the death of their body. People will willingly sacrifice their bodies if they perceive it as the only way to avoid losing their souls, losing their minds, or losing faith. So he says there's a kind of a deep psychological process at work behind these violent men, that they will happily get into a fight where they may be killed. They don't care about that. But what they cannot do is endure humiliation, degradation. And so he's saying, think more deeply about the psychology of this kind of violence. And this is really important. And it lets us distinguish different kinds of violence, which I'll point out in a minute. Okay. So he says, the priority humans place on honor and self-respect, including the honor of one's group and culture, of physical comfort and even survival, into only humanity's most unique attribute, but also our most dangerous. Okay, so this honor is not only there's a fundamental aspect of being human, of wanting to be respected, wanting to be recognized as a human being, wanting to be treated as anything. This is not only crucial to what we are as people, it's also a really dangerous part of what we are as people, because disrupting that can lead to certain kinds of violence. Okay, so that's the point at which we need to bring in this idea of, okay, remember we're talking about rational self-interest, and now I'm saying it, actually rational self-interest is one thing, there's this other thing going on, there's this, let's call it irrational self-interest, kind of psychological, emotional self-interest. And often people talk about this in terms of the expression senseless violence, okay? And it's almost like the term senseless violence means that there's other violence that is sensible, that is rational, that is understandable and motivated, and the kinds of violence that just seem crazy. But we are all the time attempting to make sense of these different kinds of violence. So if we see the craziest people like serial murderers, and we see these the investigative documentaries or fictional stories about them, and there's a point where they start trying to make it make sense. Like, how can a person end up being that crazy and destructive? And then often they'll bring in a psychological story. That maybe this is linked to mental illness. Maybe it's linked to a developmental trauma in childhood. But all of those things, like these ideas of maybe it's psychological, maybe it's neurological, that helps make sense of what seems to be senseless. And that's really helpful, but it also only extends to some things. Similarly, the other kinds of craziness that we see, like talking about like terrorist violence, okay, that people who threaten society with violence and seem to do sort of crazy stuff, they end up killing themselves in their great desire to be violent towards a particular society. Once again, there's kind of explanations that are mobilized, like, okay, what's this? And they can be social, they can be political, they can be religious, bring in ideas of extremism, ideas of radicalization. All of these become ways of making sense of something that initially just seems, wow, that's crazy. So there we are seeing more kind of social cultural explanations going on. But also those are very helpful, but also explain certain kinds of things rather than others. So the question that Gilligan's really leaving us with is, can we integrate all these different understandings? And he refers to the idea of a biopsychosocial approach that combines the physical, the psychological, and the social. Can we combine these all together? Can we combine rational self-interest with psychological motives, with cultural factors? And how would we do that? Okay, and I think that's really important. But let's just focus there on a couple of different distinctions, which I think are really useful before we wrap up. So firstly, and Gilligan was contrasting this kind of, rationally motivated violence with this kind of like people just becoming chaotically violent when they feel their sense of self is being threatened. There's a really great set of terms that distinguish that, which is the difference between instrumental and expressive violence. Okay, so this is really important distinction to remember. Instrumental violence is when you're doing violence to achieve something. That's the rational self-interest. I'm mugging this person because I want money so that I can buy stuff. Okay, so it's deliberate, it's intentional, it's goal-directed. And Gilligan was saying we kind of overestimate how much violence is instrumental, and we underestimate what, in this set of terms, is referred to as expressive violence. That's emotional violence. That's violence that is expressing a kind of internal emotional state. Someone getting into a fight because someone has insulted them or humiliated them in some way. Someone attacking their partner because they feel jealous. Something like that. So you get that a lot more violence than we realize is expressive, in the sense that it's triggered by very, very intense emotions rather than calculated to achieve certain gains. But we need to acknowledge both of these. We need to acknowledge the instrumental violence, and we need to acknowledge expressive violence. The other distinction that's really worth looking at is offensive violence versus defensive violence. Offensive violence is attacking. Okay, so you decide to go and bully someone. You decide to go and attack another country, as opposed to defensive violence, which is violence of self-protection. Okay, and so in law we tend to be like, oh, there's certain situations in which you're allowed to use self-protective violence. You're allowed to use violence in self-defense. The cops can shoot someone, but only if they are in immediate danger themselves and they can't manage it any other way. You can wage a war with a country if they attacked you first. Now, what's interesting about that is that people when they think about their own violence, there's a number of things, and this is really important. I want you to think very deeply about this. Firstly, they tend not to even notice their own violence. They tend not to think of the things they're doing as violence, but they do tend to think of other people doing those kinds of things as violent. Secondly, they tend to see their own violence as defensive, as self-defense, not as attack. And also they tend to see it as necessary and justifiable. So there's kind of built-in bias that we see our own violence, if we see it at all, as being defensive, necessary, and justifiable. On the other hand, we see other people's violence as offensive, as attacking, as unjustified. And not only that, but we tend to attribute our own violence to situations. Well, I only did that because this thing happened. Like I only started shouting at that person because they tripped me. But other people's violence we tend to see as an expression of their character or their culture. Oh, well, that person started shouting at me because they're just a shit person. They're just a mean, angry, horrible person. Or they come from a culture that is always being aggressive. So there's both a kind of the concealment of our own violence, invisibility of our own violence, and the justification of our own violence, and the attribution of our violence to circumstances. Whereas looking at other people's violence, it's very visible to us. It seems usually unjustified, it seems aggressive, and it seems to be an expression of who they are, not of what situation they found themselves in. So we need to be aware of these constant biases that are operating. Okay, so just to summarize all of that, we started by saying, essentially, don't believe everything you think. That you have beliefs, you have interpretations, you have understandings that seem to make sense, that seem to be obvious, but actually you don't know where they came from, and you don't know whether they're true or not. They may not be true. And that we need to reorient ourselves from this idea of kind of common sense, from, oh, everybody knows that that's like that, to saying, is it though? How did we come to believe that? Why do we believe that? What are our own assumptions? What are the kind of biases in our own thought? And how do those actually prevent us making a less violent society? How do they prevent us? How do those things, those ideas that we're not even properly aware of or haven't tested, how do they actually put us in danger, make us do things that don't protect us, that actually escalate violence? How do they make the world more dangerous for everyone? And what can we do about that? And the what can we do about that, then we're going to unfold now in a number of stages, looking at different themes, looking at different kinds of things, looking at a range of things, like everything from disciplining children to owning guns to wars and genocides to violence in families to violence in relationships to the way in which people's sense of self is constructed in a way that kind of predisposes them to react either violently or non-violently. But begin with this question of asking yourself in a deep way, and in relation to a lot of examples, what do I already believe about violence? That's the first question. What is it I already believe? What do I already believe about why people get into fights when they're in relationships? Why people spank their children? Why this country went to war with that country? What is it I believe about those things? And then allow that to open the second question, which is an important one, but is that actually true? Is that the most accurate explanation that it's possible to have?